Excellent. And we always like to get a happy snap for the group, trying to get as few people with their eyes closed as possible, but you know.
James is going to do the 1, 2, 3 and everyone smile, okay?
Yeah. Oh, good work, Dean. I didn't see you blink once. Hey, do that again, Dean. I'll get a copy of
Chris,
that one, mate.
stop it.
Yeah. Remember, there will be a B-roll that goes on LinkedIn if you're concerned. Okay. All right. Shall we kick it off, Ron?
I think we should get underway. Yes.
Yeah. Excellent. Excellent. All right. Well, welcome everybody. And as always, oops, there's David coming in. Like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of lands around Australia and recognising elders past and present. And then while David gets himself sorted, it looks like he's on his way. Yep, there's David. What I will do is jump straight to a screen share, and I just want to make sure everybody's got access to either an iPhone or iPad, or preferably laptop, presuming they're in front of it, because we're going to do a bit of interaction today as we go along.
Yep, so your screen share's up.
Yep, screen share's up, beauty. All right, we'll go straight to present mode, present anyway. Okie dokie, just confirming, can everyone see what I can see there? So the just a blank slide with the community of risk management on it at the front. Yep, great.
Just give us a thumbs up if you can.
Yep. And
Fantastic.
so if you haven't already done it, just jump on any device. You don't need an app or anything for it. If you want to just jump on any device and go to the web address in front of you, which is menti.com, it should ask you to put the code in. And the code is
on your smartphone.
Yeah, probably the quickest and easiest is just grab your iPhone or smartphone next to you. Just jump on to menti.com.
Have you got a QR code, James?
No, this one doesn't use a QR code, but no, sorry, it can use it, but we don't have it this time. So if you don't need an app or anything, just jump on to
menti.com.
Menti.com, bang in that code. What it will allow you to do is follow along with the presentation today, but then there'll also be a couple of interaction points as well. So just while I let everyone get themselves sorted on that, we'll do a quick introduction.
Yeah.
So look, today's session is all about effectively managing psychosocial hazards in the workplace. The reason why you can't, Bronwyn, did you want the URL? I just saw it pop up. It's www.menti.com if you can't see it, menti.com. So quite recently, the New South Wales safety regulator, Safe Work New South Wales is what they're now called, released a code of practice on managing psychosocial hazards in the workplace. It's got quite some significant content in there, and it's certainly got a lot of positive aspects that employers particularly can take away to help manage this issue. And so based on the feedback over the last couple of months with people in the group, we thought it'd be a great opportunity to discuss what it actually looks like in terms of practical application. So if everyone's got that code, I'll just move on because it'll be on every subsequent slide anyway. So for those that haven't joined us before, the whole why of this community of risk management is really those three things that we've itemized for you there. So it started at the start of COVID as an opportunity for professionals in the risk and governance space to connect with each other and find out what was going on across across sectors and geographies. It's evolved into a lot more than that now, being an informal professional development space. And it's also a place to build connections and resources. And I'll just go back because I just saw someone else saying they've lost the code. So just go back to that. Yep.
8375962. That's the code you need to tap in when you get to Menti.
8375962.
And thanks, Andrew Hollier.
Yep. Thank you. All righty, we'll move on. Okay, so that's our why. So let's just talk about some straight up statistics, because I know Chris is with me on this. There's a few nerds in the room, and nerds like us love statistics, numbers, and ultimately for those of us that run businesses, money talks. So that's a great way to, I guess, make everything real, is talk about the actual dollar costs of things. So statistics show us that psychological claims on average cost greater than 50% more than physical claims. So in effect, and I'm not demeaning anyone that's had an injury, it's a lot cheaper to lop an arm off than it is to have a psychological claim at work, both in time lost and cost to the organisation. So you're
There's
talking
that
about
caring side coming out in you, James.
yeah.
Whatever you do, don't get a psych injury.
That's right. That's right. I'm a caring bloke. For those that know me would know that, yeah, I'm all about feelings. So the average cost in lost time equates to about $45,000 per claim, or the equivalent of 4 months lost time. That's the average as well. And at the end, Chris, when we go to general discussion, it'd be awesome if I can get you to insert some more detail into those statistics to help round out the figures, if that's all good. Yep, excellent. Okay, so then when you look at the CIRA website, you can see that between 2017 and 2021, in that time span on average, there was about 578 claims per month made across the state in relation to psychological injury at work. So it's quite a big number when you think about it. So that's obviously all industries, all sectors, but 578 per month. However, when we delve a little bit deeper into that, we see that, interestingly, and I don't have a full read on this, and somebody might have a perspective as we go further into the presentation, when we chart that number over the period from March last year, which was where we saw a particular spike in claims off the back of the first round of COVID, coming through to March this year, 2021, we noted that it's actually March 2021 that has set a new benchmark, which you can see up there as 880 claims for psychological work-related injury lodged for the month. So it's set a new high. And I guess speculating on what's currently going on across a number of states, there may be the chance that that number will grow even higher in the coming months. So, Bron, did you want to add something to that? I've just got the dog whining at the door, and I'm just going to quickly pause my feed.
I think it's fair to say that psychological claims take longer to kind of manifest in a way. So a physical injury is often very immediate, but a psychological claim will take longer to manifest. So there's a bit of a lag time there, and there's probably a build up to this, as opposed to I went to lift something and I hurt my back, which is an immediate thing. So it could be in these stats that we're starting to see time lag. And I think one of the things as we go through this today that it's important to remember is that psychological claims are being impacted by our COVID environment at the moment, but it's also important to give consideration to other issues that are now starting to manifest, I guess, in a way around bullying, harassment, increases in workplace violence, etc., etc. COVID is not the only thing that's driving increases in psychological claims. And, you know, if we get to delve underneath that a little bit more, you'll see bullying, harassment, violence, and those sorts of things are how we interact, conflict in the workplace. It's all interlinked, and these are all things that can drive psychological claims. So I think it's important to keep that in the back of your mind. When you're thinking about solutions, don't just think about what can I do for COVID. It's really important to think about the broader workplace environment. And I'll get into that in a little bit more detail towards the end of this.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Bron. I'll move on. Okay. Oops, did we... Just let me double check. I think we dropped one there. That's okay. We'll do that. Okay, so on to the code of practice, Bron. So it's over to you.
Okay, beautiful. So SafeWork New South Wales is the first safety regulator that's released this type of code of practice. And what's interesting, and as for us as WHS and risk professionals, we know that a code of practice places obligations on PCBUs and workers. So we know codes of practice are admissible as evidence in court proceedings, as information about hazards and risks that PCBUs ought reasonably to have known. So a code of practice has a higher standing than, say, a piece of guidance material. And I know SafeWork Australia have issued guidance material, as have other regulators. But this being a code of practice will now become admissible as evidence in court, as I said, around hazards and risks that ought reasonably to have been known. So WHS covers both physical and psychological safety, and this new code of practice supports organisations with the hazards and risks associated with psychological safety in the workplace. So that, as we've already covered earlier, there is growing evidence to suggest that workers' comp claims are increasing during the pandemic period in relation to both physical and psychological safety. But a recent study done by SafeWork New South Wales that included 4,000 employers and 8,000 employees, in that study, it was revealed that workers and supervisors are reporting negative impacts to their mental health in the last 12 months, and that we must give consideration to bullying, harassment and workplace violence, as these are increasing and these are listed in the code of practice as contributing hazards. But the new code of practice is actually quite comprehensive, and James and I have spent a bit of time reading it and discussing it between ourselves. It covers psychosocial hazards and what they could look like with scenarios and examples, so it's quite informative. Now, what's really important is that it does cover what reasonable management action is, because we know, and not being too cynical, but often if individuals are under pressure from performance management, they might then consider that to be a psychological injury. But the legislation and the code does cover what reasonable management action is. It does cause stress, but it is not a psychosocial hazard, and it provides link to the Fair Work Commission here as well to have more detail around what a reasonable management action is. But the code itself provides practical examples of how both officers and workers can meet their WHS obligations in managing psychosocial hazards. And the appendix, which is really informative, covers psychosocial risks for different industries, including what their hazard risk and risk controls are. So it's very practical. It takes you through the 4 steps of the risk assessment process, and does include, of course, taking a risk managed approach to all of this. But it's very helpful that they've broken it down by industry, and in there is, healthcare workers, retail, hospitality, mining, et cetera, So it's quite comprehensive in that regard. It also provides some really good advice about investigating incidents when a report's received. So what's really important here is to make sure that you follow your organisational procedures for complaint management and incident reporting and incident investigation. So, take the time to have a read of it, but that's our brief summary on what's covered in the code.
Yeah, and I think probably so looping back to kind of nail down the points that we've covered, we know, and I think we don't need to say to this group twice, that psychological injuries are a significant cost impost on the organisation, not to mention productivity loss, not to mention cultural disintegration and damage that they cause. We don't need to overstate that. However, as Bron noted, in terms of the reasonable management action piece, I think it's very important to note that as employers, that is such a significant risk exposure issue for anyone that's in an employer or in a managerial position. It's an extremely, and I know Chris and Warwick will probably have some more to add at the end there. It's an extremely difficult position to be in, and without oversimplifying it, it really means that if you're not absolutely locked-tight on your documented internal processes and you're following them to the letter of the law, it leaves you extremely exposed in that space. And I think, as Bronwyn alluded to as well, we're seeing this evidence that, look, even despite COVID, there's clearly an elevating presence of psychological illness in the community in general. That's a known fact. And then that is obviously presenting more regularly in work in a number of different ways. And that produces a number of different risk exposures for the employer and for workers. This code of practice is designed to try and make that process of managing it more effective. What we're going to go on to shortly now is, again, for those that are as old as we are, you might remember the landmark Royal Commission into the systemic bullying at work covered. I can see Chris smiling and Warwick's probably smiling as well. I don't know, Kath, if that's something that you remember. There was an academic called Dr. Carlo Caponicia that founded a whole career based on that Royal Commission report, which was, I think it was called Words to the Effect of Bullying, We Just Want It to Stop. So it was a landmark piece of work that detailed systemic bullying and psychological injury issues within work cover itself. So the irony wasn't lost on us that a few years down the track later, the same regulators coming out with a code of practice on managing psychological injuries in the workplace.
Maybe they had an enforceable undertaking with them. But it did also make me think about AMP. So the financial institution AMP and the issues that they've faced over recent years in relation to bullying and sexual harassment in the workplace. And there's, any number. I think it's, is it the mining regulator, James, it's just issued some information around inclusion in the workplace as well.
Yep.
So, it's coming at us from all angles. It's not something that's just isolated by industry or by type. So, everyone's sort of out there now trying to make improvements. So I do think it's a good step forward that this code of practice has come about.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so let's have a bit of fun for a second. Can I get you guys, and hopefully everyone can see it this time, jump back on your smart device. And we call these straw polls, but I guess you can call them whatever you want. This is just a thermometer test.
I call it James having a play with games.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, boys with toys, whatever you feel like. So if you jump on and use the code, we'd like to see as a group how confident you are in the systems that your organisation currently has in place to manage psychosocial risks. And we want to see, based on that, we'll move to let's call it the call to action to find out, all right, well, now we understand that this is all there. What can we do about it in a practical sense? Okay, we're starting to see some numbers come up now. All right, we'll just give you one more second, but I'm assuming most people have had a chance to fire in a response at this point.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's looking good.
Yeah, I mean, look, to be honest, we run these straw polls quite often around these types of issues. That's certainly probably, Bron, don't you reckon, fairly consistent with what we see when we ask those types of questions to most organisations at the moment. So we're seeing that the weight in that triangle is leaning very obviously towards a level of somewhat confidence, but yeah, realistically, we know that there's not the greatest proportion of people feeling very confident in that. So I think, no doubt we are talking subjective stuff, but it's good to understand that most people seem to feel as though their organisation has got something in place, but there's always room for it to improve and get better. So that's the most important bit, really. So let's move on to that. Okay, so the first one, and again, me being Mr. Sarcastic, as I like to be anyway, I've loved over the years the way that these codes of practice always get leveled at us with the just take a risk management approach to this, as though it's some sort of like, oh, wow, that's easy. How could I have never thought of that? And if I do that, then everything will be mystically resolved.
It's all in the quality of the risk assessment.
That's right. That's right. They say it every time, but we always sit there, and this one's no different, and go, what does that actually mean? So we thought one approach that you could take, and this will depend on your organisation, is right at that top level of governance. If you've got an organisation that's got a board of directors, or let's call it a committee, or even a steering committee, even if you don't have a board of directors, give some serious consideration to, is psychosocial or psychological risk actually an existing risk issue on your risk register? So the question you need to ask yourself is, if it's not, and you do have an enterprise level risk register, that should guide you towards your first piece of action. So let's call it in a typical organization where this would work in an effective fashion, The board of directors would likely to be across a strategic risk register that includes all of the really critical aspects of the organisation that could potentially bring it to its knees. What we're now seeing is that psychosocial risk, which is really, ultimately related to culture and conduct, could be one of those risks that is material and that could have a significant effect on the organisation. Think about the bullying incident that involved the young lady taking her own life in Melbourne. We know that that could result in a very significant material outcome for the organisation if nothing's done. So if you haven't already done that, rather than trying to get tied up in risk assessment methodology, ask yourself the question, have we adequately even categorised psychosocial risk as a risk issue on our risk register? So if you have, you're a step in front. If you haven't, we would suggest you've got some work to do. Yeah.
And the other good example that we like to refer to when we talk about, an example of bullying and harassment is the one in South Australia of Tadmar Electrical. And, go and Google that one and Google up Rowan Chenoweth, the two supervisors, but very clearly, held to account via the WHS Act and regulation in terms of those supervisors and that company being held to account there. But I challenge you to have a look at that and just see, could that happen in your workplace? And if not, why not? But clearly the construction building industry has issues, as well as, the corporates with, a whole host of things. What we know comes about in retail, hospitality, our younger workers, and we've talked about that from time to time and how vulnerable they can be when it comes to workplace violence. So, considering psychosocial risk as something on your risk register is actually, something for everybody, I think.
Yep, absolutely. So, okay, second.
Okay, so just some other things that you can do, because, we always like to have really practical examples of, we know that this might be an issue for us, but what do we do next? What's the steps we can do next? So we've talked about adding it to your risk register, but making sure that you've got documented procedures, and that means for things like a code of conduct, whistleblower, how you deal with complaints and disputes, and performance management, these sorts of things, making sure you've got clearly documented procedures and that you follow them. That's really important. And, there's lots of examples of times when we might have policies and procedures in place, but what'll bring us undone is we don't follow them. And then that can end you up in a courtroom.
I was going to say with that one, Bron, as well, that's probably the Ian Livingston Blevins example there. Do you reckon?
I think role model, yeah.
Yeah. There's a famous story we recount regularly to clients and friends alike. So I apologise if I've already told you this. One of my favourite managers of all times was a South African mine manager who was notoriously hard-nosed. However, he wasn't actually hard-nosed when you got to know him. He was just extremely driven, and he set an exceptionally high benchmark for himself and others. And so because he, on one hand, people would say he had this authoritarian culture that didn't promote sort of, freedom of decision. On the other hand, when it comes to this sort of stuff, we never had issues working under him when it came to these types of issues, because there was a standard and there was operational discipline around that standard, and people were held to account for that, so that if there was an internal process in place, you were expected to follow it. And if you didn't, there would be ramifications. And he was unafraid to call people out personally, including senior managers, for when they failed to do so. And so because that was let's call it the benchmark that was set, these types of things were followed, and they were followed properly to an outcome that actually was to the betterment of the organisation. I'm not commenting more broadly around that management style, but that's just the example that we use, that often things just come down to very strong leadership and operational discipline around following internal processes and procedures. Don't you reckon, Bron?
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, having those documented policies and procedures and following them, it will, stand you in good stead and gives you a good basis on which, any action you're going to be taking. But also important when you think about psychosocial hazards is making sure that you create an environment where it's safe to speak up and share ideas. So that's really important. making sure that there's opportunity for people to have their say and that they feel like they can speak up and will be valued in doing so, or will be listened to, and an opportunity to share ideas, however your organisation might do that. Providing regular training for staff, and that can be around things like training on your policies, your code of conduct, complaints, performance management, and that kind of thing. But it can also be more practical. And James and I have just been working with a client, a good example, where we've been supporting them in the delivery of conflict management training. So how to deal with conflict in the workplace appropriately and how to de-escalate sort of, situations that might arise either through internal conflict or through customers, creating events of violence or aggression in the workplace, but providing training around that to support your team members. Making sure you have that culture of accountability, as James mentioned. So set KPIs and objectives, monitor performance, coach people, always thinking about how can I coach my team if they're not meeting performance, thinking about managing up rather than managing out straight away. So having that coaching mindset, but holding people to account for their performance and for their actions, really important. The other thing is to make sure that we've got our third parties sort of, in the loop. So that's around making sure your clients, contractors and customers understand what's expected when they're in your workplace. So making sure that, if you've got contractors coming onto site, that they understand the behaviours expected of them when they're on your site. The last thing you want is, clients and contractors or customers creating an event for you and impacting the psychological safety of your workplace. So they need to understand what's expected when they're in your workplace. And I think in the code of practice on page 14, there's some really good examples there of what that could look like.
Yeah, and I think John, and for any of the other mining services representatives in the room, I think that's particularly relevant for you guys, because often you're no doubt at the mercy of being, largely potentially abused by your clients, but reciprocally for the mine operators, they need to set a standard where it's not okay, where the examples I can think of from over the years is, drivers come in to deliver things to stores in mine sites or to, let's call it, to factories, and they carry on and abuse the admin staff and say, I'm in a bloody hurry, just effing hurry up, all that sort of thing. It's about creating a culture where that's not an acceptable way to be spoken to or to speak to others. And it sounds a little bit arbitrary, but they're the kinds of things that create psychosocial risk, which no doubt then lead to potentially people submitting psychological claims as a result of.
And so think about your induction processes, for example, when you're inducting people into your workplace, then what sort of information are you giving them around this about what's expected of them? But I know that, in the past, we've certainly dealt with clients that they might not be in mining or mining services in that sort of area, but they'll have contractors, maybe building contractors on site and, that kind of thing. So it's important that everyone understands. And of course, we're certainly seeing more signage up around workplaces now about being kind to the staff or that sort of thing. Just workplace aggression in the workplace from customers, is kind of on the rise in our current environment as well. So making sure everyone knows what's expected, I guess, of them when they're in your workplace. Some other things that you can do more practically is make sure that you investigate complaints and concerns when they're raised, so in a timely manner. So follow your processes for investigation. Make sure your investigation processes and procedures include not only investigating physical incidents, but also psychosocial or psychological incidents as well. So making sure that your policies and procedures are up to date and you use them when complaints or concerns are raised. And as I said earlier, there's some good information in that code of practice around investigation. And then, making sure that you include in your reporting processes, because everybody reports on their physical injuries, report on your psychosocial or psychological injuries and have a look at trend analysis as well, sort of mapping the trends. So there's some practical things there that you can do in terms of making sure your organisation is prepared to implement this new code of practice.
Yeah, and look, I think we're always more than happy to have a yarn to anyone in the group afterwards if they don't kind of conceptualize what this sort of strategic risk register piece looks like. But from our perspective, we just thought, because look, there's like 38 or more different risk assessment techniques that are recognized in the standard and through the handbooks. Largely, you look at all of them and you go, I think, Chris, we spoke about it this morning, it feels very arbitrary trying to apply that process to a psychosocial hazard. So that's why we thought, look, don't get yourself lost in translation. Start at the top and go, do we have this as a material risk on our risk register? If we don't, we need to think about possibly adding it, because ultimately that should drive those points 2, 3, 4, and 5, plus the extra ones that Bronwyn has discussed as well.
And have a look in the appendix. I mean, there's healthcare, schools, government call centres, construction, mining, retail. There's some really good examples in there of hazards, risk and risk controls that might help you build on your risk assessment. So just, having a good read of that code, I think, will be important as you start to implement this in your workplace.
Excellent. Thanks, Bron. Well, look, what we'll do is we'll send out that deck to everyone after this, and obviously we record these sessions, so it'll just go up onto YouTube. But we'd love to go to some open discussion for the last 10 to 15 minutes. But Chris, I hoped just to lead us off, if you could nerd it up for us to add a little bit more bulk and context to some of the statistics and numbers that we brought forward. Yeah.
That's not a thing. And you're not
it is. James and I had a great morning talking about facts and figures. It was awesome. Look, this data is 12 months old, and I am looking to get it updated because I would like to see the impacts of COVID on this. But there was 1 in 5 employees that are likely to be experiencing a mental health condition, and it's been recorded that untreated depression attributed to 1.9 million working days lost in New South Wales each year. From a dollars perspective, that translates to about $3.2 billion, which is pretty full on in the scheme of things.
And we're really talking absenteeism, aren't we, Chris? That's what that means.
Lost productivity and cost of replacement, all of the things that go with it. Yeah.
So that's some pretty heavy figures. To touch on some of the variations in the workers' comp claims to what James presented before, a traumatic joint injury is only about $17,500 on average per claim, and it's about 48 days loss of work. So, and then a smaller injury, like a laceration or a sprain, is only about $8,500 and 22 days lost time. So when you compare that to the psychological claims of, roughly $45,000 on average, and your 4 months, it's a pretty big difference in time lost and your average cost of claims. So the impact on the business is really significant, and something that really needs to be considered heavily by the workplace, I'd imagine.
Yeah. Awesome. No, thanks, Chris. That's great context. I think, Dean, did you have something to add to that as well?
Yeah, James. I just submitted a blog you're interested in about the why risk management is so important going forward. And I've been reading McKinsey reports from June, July currently. They're saying basically for all the companies that put $1 into looking after psycho and mental health issues in their business, they'll save over $3.20 in those people being off work, plus $2.70, $2.80 for absenteeism. So it's a $6 return on that. McKinsey in this survey I read said for 2021, they said that 42% of people who were surveyed admitted psycho mental issues at work. 44% said they're really looking forward to moving on out of the business wherever they're working. and they estimate that the cost in 2021 in America will be $1 trillion.
Wow.
Wow.
And I've got that all documented if you want to look at it. But that's basically, I
Yep.
said it about half an hour ago. I was
Oh,
reading,
great. Yeah. Yeah.
it's paraphrased, but yeah, those numbers are quite startling for June, July 2021, and it's surveying that, and I was quite gobsmacked by those numbers, and I just wanted to just come in and just let you know that now.
Yeah, no, that's great, Dean. And yeah, for those that may not know Dean, so Dean's our head of business analytics and also does a monthly blog for us. So yes, Daniel, in response to your question, we'll definitely get that out to the group because it'll be some pretty startling figures. So Dean, thank you. Thanks for putting that forward, mate. And I think it's, no doubt all of us. I mean, my wife was only saying the thing I wanted to personally share. My wife was only saying the other day, and I don't know if I'm speaking for other small business owners. I feel like at times this period, it's kind of hardened a lot of us in terms of hardened us against other people and certainly hardened us against the government. But that's a totally separate conversation. And I think from a business owner's perspective, it can be quite tough, even if your business is doing well, to not sort of, I don't know, there's just a general feeling of frustration and angst in the air. And I think Bron and I certainly notice it because we travel interstate a lot for work, that there's a lot of evasive behavior going on, and there's a lot of, people are very quick to point fingers, and there's just this general discontent in the air. And I think that probably contributes to the statistical increases we're seeing in psychological claims. But no doubt, as you said, Chris, due to the lag, we may see even more significant upturn. So anyway,
And the Australian Human
James?
Resources Institute also put out an article overnight they interviewed some people from Harvard about psychological safety. We're going to make sure we send that article out to the group after the session today because it's a really interesting read. So it's not just an issue here in Australia, it's an international issue. I think lots of organisations, and certainly as Dean's alluded to, are facing sort of the pressures in relation to psychosocial safety in the workplace.
I think one of the big things as well, we've talked about absenteeism, but one of the big things in psychosocial hazards is presenteeism. So people are turning up to work, but they're not actually there, or their output is significantly reduced, and that's something that we don't calculate and we don't have the figures for. But the estimated figures for that are about 3 times or 4 times more than what the absenteeism rates are. So the actual scale of the problem is, I don't think we really even know what the scale of the problem really is until, like Dean said, you actually start investing in it and you start to see that increased productivity in your workforce. You might have somebody who you just think that's the pace that they work at, but you fix the psychosocial issues that they've got, and all of a sudden their productivity will massively increase. And I think the other problem with the psychosocial issues in the workplace, I know 2 injuries that we currently have that haven't been reported properly, not through the proper WHS channels. We tend to take them down the HR route, and they don't always come into those official statistics. They get morphed into performance issues, and the minute it starts to do that, I think there's a big sort of, I'm not going to say cover up by HR, but it tends to be a sort of closed door, and trying to get in to actually give that person help and support is quite hard.
I think you also just raised the point there, Kath, on the there's a bit of a grey line between all of these issues as well. So it isn't as black and white as it becomes a workers' comp claim. The person hasn't presented, and all of these issues have fleshed out of a single incident at work. And I'm fairly sure Jen, I think she's on, would support this. I don't recall one workers' comp claim where there hasn't been some pre-existing psychological challenges in a person's life prior to their actual claim. So it isn't just isolated to a specific incident. So,
and even when it is a specific incident, you'll find that there are previous incidents that may be in either the worker's social life or even work life that you could argue have precipitated them. The incident where we've had probably at least 2 that I know of in the last 12 months of being the straw that broke the camel's back. So, you know, had we intervened 6 months earlier and actually dealt with the psychosocial issues, we wouldn't be left with what we're left with.
I know it's a mining. Sorry, Chris. I know it's a mining specific angle again, but I know John would support me on this. Being a former underground coal miner himself, is that there's this, that why we emphasise the culture aspect strongly. So culturally, to use your example, Kath, what I've seen time and time again is there's a sort of subtle bullying mentality in a certain crew directed towards a certain person. It might evolve into a number of different things, and it might involve them raising an informal complaint with their supervisor, which is informally discussed. And it kind of, as you said, it goes along, and then eventually it goes poof, and something comes out the end. And it's not a linear or direct incident pathway. It's a contributory sort of, you know, multi-layered thing. So I think that aligns with what everyone else is saying.
And it also goes into the HR process and gets, and, you know, swallowed up in that process, as opposed to becoming a work health and safety injury, which is technically both, but the overlap there is quite large. And I don't think most organisations have really separated out those processes that need to take place. Both there is a HR process that needs to take place, but there's also a return to work and an injury management process that needs to take place. And I don't think organisations do particularly well at combining the two.
John, did you want to add something there?
Just going up on what you said about, especially underground, it's also getting the supervisors and management to believe the guy, you know, that he has an injury, because they can't see it. And then when it does happen, sometimes bullying gets worse, because the guys in the crew think that he's just pulling the chain and he just wants an easy job, and he just wants this or he just wants that. So that's another hurdle that I think everyone's got to get over to ensure that these guys or gals get the proper attention that they need.
Can I say something from the disability sector wise? The exact same things happening around workers' comp, but also people are not they don't feel comfortable to speak up because they might lose shifts and things like that, like they're casuals and things, which is creating more pressure in the workplace, depression, things like that. What I've done recently is teamed up with an organisation that measures the psychological safety of an organisation. So it does a baseline, and then it'll identify different teams or different areas of your organisation that are not as they don't feel as safe as some of the others. Like there's a lot of issues that will come out of it, but the data you can slice and dice, and it allows you to work on those teams specifically on some of the issues that they're facing, to increase their performance and safety, which in the end, what I'm bringing it back to is it's not just absenteeism and, you know, workers' comp. There's a lot of other KPIs that we'd need to be measuring, because in the disability space, we can't have no absenteeism. There's a lot of people in the sector that work, you know, through sicknesses, and they don't take enough time off, and therefore, so it's not just the one measure. We need, you know, a number of different KPIs.
And probably oh, sorry, David.
I was going to say, and so what we've got is some software that measures the behavior, leadership, and the team's safety, links it with the monetary impact of a KPI, so you can measure it over time to see if things are improving.
And probably, and this might play out in your space, but certainly as someone who's got you know, a younger worker in our family, the casualisation of the workforce, you know, is also something that you know, can contribute in this space. So my son, 18, casual worker, 2 organisations. Very much shifts are done week by week. As a younger person, less likely to want to speak up, less likely to have the confidence to speak up if there's anything going on. And he's a casual. So as you've alluded to, David, that loss of shift and being a younger worker if there's anything going on in his space, he doesn't want to rock the boat. He's not confident in that space, and he knows he's not getting shifts next week if he's creating a problem this week. So there's that casualisation of the workforce, I think, is something that absolutely contributes in this space.
And it's similar to what Kath was just saying, is that the HR departments they're not often aware of it. It's coming from their leaders in operations or whoever's doing the rosters and the relationships that they've got. And then in the end, you know, it could be a performance issue or something. So there's a missing link in all of that.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't mean to stop the discussion by talking about disability.
It's good to see you have that impact, David.
But it is interesting because it's obviously a common denominator, and I guess that's probably one thing I take away from this meeting is I probably need to go back to HR and have that conversation on those missing links, and probably some guidance on how we look to remedy that, because again, nobody likes an LTI in your company. That's the big issue. So you suddenly raise it up as a psychosocial incident, and it's not a performance management piece, then it's, you know, your KPIs blown.
Yeah, and there's a lot of stakeholders sort of at play here when you think about it. When you've got, you know, you got your safety team, you got your workers' comp team, you got the HR team. You know, there's a whole load of stakeholders that probably need to start, you know, thinking about this. The risk team, the quality team, the people that manage your contractors. You know, the people that do all the customer service work and customer service standards. And there's a lot of stakeholders that can, you know, jump in here and have input into, you know, doing your risk assessment, as they say, you know, but thinking about and bringing different views to the table. So that's probably a good place to at least get the discussion on the table and get those stakeholders in a room.
Sorry, I did it twice, Chris. Go.
So that comes back to the culture piece, Bron, that you were talking about in your presentation. We tend to see that those departments don't talk at all.
Yeah, silos.
We're going between different departments to get information, and they're both doing different things that are almost counterintuitive to each other. So it does create a challenge for a business. But over to you, Jane.
I was just going to say, I think the grey space inevitably lands, and, you know, if I'm sort of bringing together what I think Dave and Kath and John are saying, well, all of us are saying really, is that it's exceedingly difficult in many ways to make dramatic, sudden shifts to culture. And a lot of this aligns to let's call it longer term systemic cultural pieces within a lot of different sectors. And that's peculiar to different sectors. Because I think that the good thing about the code of practice is it calls out, you know, the fact that it identifies, for example, low role control, or an absence of an ability to, you know, Yeah. I think it's good that it calls that out, but at the same time, it qualifies it to say, well, if you're an apprentice in a building company, you're not going to be expecting to be part of the decisions the CEO makes. And I think you need to, you know, suck that one up because you're an apprentice. You've got to sort of separate out those delicate grey issues versus if you've got and I can think of 6 different examples that I know have occurred in psychological claims in previous workplaces where a supervisor takes a particular set on someone and rather than performance managing them, does those subtle things, and the code calls them all out. So, you know, they take away their resources, they stop giving them shifts, they just sort of do these subtle psychosocial little pinpricks at them. And then eventually, as Kath said, 3 or 4 months down the track, boom, it explodes into an actual full-blown psychological claim. But the issue we're actually looking to address here is back up at those steps 3, 2, and 1. So looking at how we can positively impact the culture to make it a culture where those kinds of issues don't gestate because they are slow moving. So yeah, no, I was going to say, I know Rupert had a perspective to add, and I know it's not Oz specific, but that's exactly why we like it, because a different jurisdiction, different economy. So over to you, Rupert.
Yeah, I don't know if anything I'll say will be relevant, but I guess from your point of view, the one of the things I've observed is how companies that are domiciled or headquartered in places like Australia or Northern Europe with good laws on paper at least are behaving really shittily to the people in their subsidiaries. So to give a couple of practical examples, I'm embedded with a Swedish organization, and one of their key employees in Indonesia got COVID, and they basically did nothing about it in terms of no real medical support. There wasn't a whole lot they could do. But then on top of that, when the person was still pretty sick, they're pestering them, trying to get them to come back to work, trying to get them on calls. And you just wouldn't be able to get away with that in Sweden where there's laws, but you can kind of export that level. And tied to that, I've seen quite a lot of sort of passive aggression increase, to your point, James, about people being grumpier. And from managers, it's a lot easier to hide. If an employee is trying to come to you going, you know, I've got this problem, or I'm stretched, I'm this and that. I'm seeing people who just aren't getting a response from their manager when they're raising very valid complaints about the workload, like people working 60, 70, 80, 90-hour weeks in some situations. The other thing is there's no respecting of, because all of our lives are blurred in terms of, you know, we're sort of accessible the whole time. I've seen public holidays run roughshod over if they're not public holidays that are respected in the headquarter country. So we suffer that quite a lot. And then, you know, like people scheduling a whole bunch of calls on public holidays. The other thing I think that's interesting is the amount of harassment claims that we've been responding to is shot up. People are sort of coming out the woodwork. And at the same token, I think there's a lot of back channeling going on because now you can access people direct without that visibility you would have had in a workplace before of who's going into whose office and what's going on here. So that definitely I would agree that there's a world more frustration and kind of grumpiness observing within the organizations, and that includes ones that are headquartered out of places, as I said, like Australia and Northern Europe and stuff. And the other thing I'd say would be the vaccine thing. So with the second dose of some of the vaccines, people can, you know, get knocked out for a few days. It's not the end of the world, but I'm not seeing very many organizations take that especially seriously, which will have health implications, both physical and mental. And so I've seen, like, you know, a lot of so there's one organization with which I'm working where one of the key employees in Malaysia just had the vax. She's got a mother with, you know, young kids. She's pretty stressed, but they were still pestering the hell out of her to get on a call the day, you know, after, where she was basically suffering mild, well, not mild, but fluish symptoms. So there's a lot of stuff written on paper about how people are going to be treating their employees, and that, but I'm not seeing that percolate from the country where there is scrutiny, like you have proper laws, to other countries like this one where there's near sod all about mental health or psychological safety or anything like that. So it's all well and good to do this sort of, you know, posturing at your headquarter level, but if you're treating employees in your other countries like crap, it does people losing respect a lot. And I'm seeing people getting to a stage where they're kind of you know, they're almost starting to be willfully disobedient and be evasive. And so it is, I would definitely say that it's not universally the case, but I've certainly seen a lot more toxicity, avoidance of difficult conversations, and just pushing pain onto people in other places.
Yeah, no, that's a great perspective, Rupert. I mean, that's exactly why we wanted to hear it, because absolutely, you know, we're all caught up in, you know, our regulators released the latest code of practice telling us what we must do. And I think it's a really valuable insight to understand, well, yeah, it's great if you're a Fortune 500 company with a subsidiary entity in Vietnam, maybe that's not really the reality on the ground for workers. And I think the only other perspective I wanted to add, and I think it links back to Charles's presentation. So for those that weren't in on it, Charles Pare, he's now working for Maersk, I think, or one of the big logistics firms.
CEVA Logistics.
Yeah.
CEVA, that's it. Yeah, but at the time he was working for Philip Morris in Spain. I think the other issue that this highlights as well is that ongoing, let's call it class division, that seems to be accelerating, where you've got frontline workers with jobs that can't be made remote suffering disproportionately worse outcomes than those workers that are generally better educated and earn higher wages and are in professional roles. that can immediately transfer their role back to an offline environment. Because I'm looking around at the room and I'm seeing most of us are in our either home offices or things like that. We're in that group of people that have roles or jobs that can be transferred on and offline. And I think this psychosocial load and all these other things that the Code of Practice talks about, they're all actually really relevant issues that if you take the time to look into the workforce, you can see them pretty quickly. Yeah, so look, we've probably got time for one more quick perspective if anyone wants to throw anything out there, and then we'll make it a wrap up. So did anyone else have any sort of 1 minute thoughts to throw into the mix?
My only thought, which is similar to what Chris, Kath and Rupert have said, but there's obviously a correlation between the psychosocial or the psychological safety measurement of an organisation and the workers' comp. So, with all the issues that you're talking about, Rupert, and especially throwing in COVID, we'd expect that there's these figures that you showed, the graph on slide 1, are only going to increase unless something is done about it. Question is, well, what are some of the things that we could do to change that? Because, it takes time for these things to get embedded in an organisation. Maybe that's for another time. Yeah.
I think great point. Sorry, Chris. You go.
No, it's a good question, Dave. We've had it just recently with a employer where unfortunately we were unsuccessful in defending a psychological claim for them. But we're going to sit down with that employer and go through their policies and procedures and what, if any, change they could make throughout that. And that this is one of those claims which goes to Kath's point of there was a bit of a bubble on for about 3 or 4 months and a number of events before it actually escalated into the claim. So it is a good one to sit down and retrospectively look at. But the employer, I guess, is sort of big enough to want to think about it in that context. And they're taking these guidelines very seriously.
Yeah, and I think if you go back to some of the things that we've talked about, which is, getting the foundations right, getting those policies and procedures in place and following them and providing the training and doing your risk assessment, they're all just basic foundations, but they'll give you a good platform to lift off in terms of, what you can do moving forward. But certainly, let's not forget the value that organisational culture plays along with all of those foundations. So you need to move on the practical pieces as well as the cultural piece in order to make this come together and make any sustainable, long-lasting improvements.
Well, that's probably a perfect note to end on because we're right on time there. So look, thank you everyone for a fantastic, engaging conversation as always. And for those that are able to, we'll be on again, same bat time, same bat channel in a month's time. And we'll look forward to catching up with everyone.
And we'll get some of these resources that we've talked about out to you after this session closes.
Yeah, and including the deck, because I've seen a few messages from people saying, can they have the deck? So yep, we'll shoot the whole lot out to everyone post this. So have a great afternoon, everyone, and stay safe and stay happy.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right. See ya. Bye.
Thanks.